Section 24 of Sir Francis Drake by Julian Corbett. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 13. The Last Treasure Hunt, Part 1. The Portugal voyage marks the decline of Drake's star, and yet, when the effect of his Armada is compared with that of Philip's, it must seem a little strange that most of his contemporaries should have considered it so great a failure. The Spaniards, as the seamen boasted, did not in all their sailing round about England so much as sink or take one ship, bark, pinnace, or cockboat of ours, or even burn so much as one sheepcote on this land. Drake and Norris had failed in their object too, though mortality amongst their men had been appalling, but when all was said and done they could point with pride to an exploit which, ere they had taught Europe the rising strength of England, men would have called incredible. In the 10 weeks of their adventure they had not only destroyed the nucleus of a new Armada, but they had taken and burnt 2 Spanish ports. They had beaten one army of the King of Spain in the field, and had made another run. They had marched a week through the heart of his territory. For 3 days they had insulted the gates of his second capital. They had captured nearly 100 sail in his waters, and all this in spite of weather, sickness, and politics enough to ruin 3 such expeditions. Sir Roger Williams told the Queen the expedition had done the King of Spain more harm and England more honour, service, and safety than all her expenditure in the Netherlands. But though at first she sent down to her 2 knights a glowing letter of thanks, and told them they had done all that valour and generalship could yield, yet she could not forgive them for not having wasted more time than they did in the north of Spain. Had they been less loyal than they were to her instructions, there is little doubt, so paralysed was the Spanish power, that the partisans of Don Antonio would have been able to deliver Lisbon into his hands. Nevertheless, both generals had to submit to a court-martial, and though they cleared themselves, Drake's opponents at court, who had gained the Queen's ear, condemned him to inactivity. In vain she was urged to loose him on the Indies, or suffer him to attack Cadiz so soon as the galleys were laid up for the winter. She would not listen, and the fruit of his splendid victory at Gravelines was allowed to rot away unplucked. For the rest of the year Drake was busy winding up the accounts of the voyage and fighting his battle at court. The inevitable result was that Philip's untiring persistence began again to be felt, and in the spring came fresh rumours of a great fleet gathering at Ferrol. The country grew alarmed, and so serious a panic seized Plymouth that the inhabitants began to abandon their homes. Drake at once hurried to his house in the town. There, with his wife and household, he quietly took up his residence, and the panic was instantly allayed. On the top of this new proof of the great admiral's power, the government received information that the King of Spain, having heard how Drake was in disgrace, was making overtures to him to enter his service. The intelligence came through Mr. Richard Drake of Esher, a kinsman and warm friend of Sir Francis, and thus may have been merely an invention to alarm the government, so limitless was the Elizabethan capacity for intrigue. Still, it had the desired effect. Richard Drake was an equerry in high favour. Some of his kinsman's Spanish prisoners were in his custody. Philip had certainly attempted a similar stroke before, and Sir Francis was promptly given the command at Plymouth, with orders to place the town in a state of defence, and prepare with fireships and otherwise to resist any attempt by the Spaniards to retaliate on the western ports. It was but little consolation. A great expedition against Panama was in contemplation, and Raleigh had obtained the command of it for himself. It was Drake's by right. It had been the dream of his life, and it was in the deepest mortification that he took up his small command. But even then his proud spirit had not felt the depth of its abasement. As it became known that the Spanish fleet was destined for Brittany, Drake asked to be allowed to attack it as it passed to the eastward, with the little squadron attached to his command. Even that was denied him. For since by the assassination of Henry III. and the succession of the Huguenot king, the centre of the great struggle had been shifted to France. The Queen was content to foster the Protestant cause by sending money and troops to the assistance of Henry of Navarre. Her navy was not permitted to complete its conquest of the seas, and all she would sanction was that a squadron should be maintained in the Atlantic to cruise for the Indian treasure ships. At the last moment Raleigh's commission was revoked. His fleet was committed to Hawkins in Frobisher, and Drake had the last mortification of seeing it depart with his rival's flag floating over the Revenge. That his self-esteem was deeply and even dangerously wounded is certain. For a while he permitted himself to contemplate an extravagant project for conquering the kingdom of Brazil for himself and Don Antonio, but the idea perished almost as soon as it was born. Impatient and masterful as he had grown, his nature was too great and loyal to revolt or even to sulk under royal frowns. In all the ardour with which he had plundered and destroyed, he threw himself into the work of making Plymouth the strong naval port of his ideal. Not only did he carry out the works sanctioned by the government, but almost entirely at his own expense he brought pure water into the town by a conduit many miles long, and constructed flour mills to provide the fleets with wholesome and sufficient biscuit, works for which his memory is honoured to this day by a yearly ceremony. If Drake's princely gift to Plymouth had any other motive than a far-sighted patriotism, it was certainly nothing less noble than a desire to regain the favour of his capricious mistress. But he was not yet to be forgiven. When the Atlantic squadron came back from a successful but barren blockade of the Spanish trade routes, Hawkins resigned and Frobisher was transferred to the narrow seas. But it was not Drake who took their place. The restless energy for which his work of coast defence was not enough, he had to expend upon fitting out a privateer squadron and promoting a syndicate to assist him with funds. The command, as his favourite captain Fenner fell sick, he committed to the adventurous Earl of Cumberland, with instructions to cruise off the Spanish coast on an inner line of blockade, and to intercept whatever escaped the Queen's ships at the Azores. For the Atlantic squadron, with Lord Thomas Howard in command, was again under orders for the Western Isles, and this was the immortal cruise when the Revenge was entrusted to Sir Richard Grenville. Who does not know the tale, and whose heart would not be moved when he tries to picture the injured admiral as he heard how the ship he loved so well had fared? While he was eating out his heart between Plymouth and the great country house of Buckland Abbey, which Sir Richard Grenville had sold him, the pride of his life, the very embodiment, as it seemed, of his savage creed, had perished in the midst of the Spanish fleet, fighting for a day and a night alone against a navy, and dealing destruction around her to the last. Of the 53 sail she fought, 4 she sank, and in the end did not surrender till not a stick was standing, till every man, every pike, every barrel of powder was spent, and Sir Richard lay gasping out his life in impotent defiance. Even then she was not conquered, for true to her name, which to those old mariners meant so much, she went down with her prize crew before she could be carried into port. A terrific storm, the like of which no living man had seen, was her knell, and about her grave were strewn along the shores of the Western Isles the wreckage of 100 Spanish ships and 3,000 Spanish corpses. So it pleased them, Sir Walter Raleigh wrote, to honour the burial of that renowned ship, the Revenge, not suffering her to perish alone for the great honour she achieved in her lifetime. It was a loss to Spain hardly less than that which the destruction of the Armada inflicted, but the tragedy was not yet at an end. For as the Revenge went down, she seemed to summon Drake to his doom. There was felt to be something ominous in her loss, for so great a name had Drake won for her that she had been chosen as the model for the new ships that had been ordered after the defeat of the Armada, and this, the most renowned of all her navy, was the only vessel the Queen had lost in all the war. By her the shock was deeply felt, and ere she had time to recover from it, there fell upon her the shadow of a danger greater than any she had yet encountered. The old Armada had failed partly because the invasion was attempted from a coast so dangerous and so hard to reach as that of Flanders, and partly from the faulty design of the unwieldy Spanish ships. But now Philip, with splendid patience, was constructing a new navy on French and English lines, and in Brittany he had secured against his enemy an advanced base which was untainted with any of the vices of Dunkirk. The danger was plain, great, and imminent, and in the hour of her trouble the Queen remembered the man who had so often filled her purse and had never lost her a ship. For all his long disgrace, he was the one figure who stood out in proportions large enough to grapple with the peril. And as the summer wore away, the merchants of Cadiz began to whisper in alarm that the dragon was to be unchained once more. End of Project